everybody, and welcome to a very unique episode of Uniquely Union. Never been on this set before myself, and I am surrounded by history, believe it or not. On my left is Mama Wanda Cox Byerley.
You better watch it, boy.
Yes, ma'am. She was my 6th and 7th grade teacher. If we had time, we could tell you all kinds of stories about that, maybe for another day, but
You wouldn't want to hear some of them.
she wouldn't want me to tell some of them. And on my right, I have Marilyn Toppins, and to most of Union County, neither of these ladies would be strangers to hardly any of you, I wouldn't think. Marilyn's my teaching colleague.
Yes,
The very one I was warned to stay away from, almost the very first one I met.
absolutely. Became fast friends.
And another unique thing about this episode is that we're on a different set. It's a little different setup. But COVID-19, it's no secret to anybody out there, has interrupted practically everything that goes on anywhere. And also, unfortunately, it has disrupted this year's Union County Heritage Festival.
Yes,
So part of our purpose in this episode is to carry on the tradition of the Union County
Heritage Festivals.
I started to call it the Historic Festival, yeah.
it is historic.
Yes.
This would have been our 16th year, which was historic, but we got interrupted by the pandemic.
Yes, we did. But this is our attempt to help carry on the tradition so you don't forget about it from last year's number 15 to what we fully expect to be year 17 next year, hopefully a regular year.
Yes,
But I am more or less facilitating the conversation of these two women.
We're going to go back to how the school systems in history has always helped with all the epidemics that came through. During the Depression in 1939, when I started first grade, we saved our pennies and took them to school to help pay for the cod liver oil pills that the schools at that time was giving out to the children.
Right.
And I have lived long enough through the Great Depression, through the wars, and through the time, and I'll be 88 years old come next April, that I have seen a lot of things come and go. But what we're going through right now is one of the most terrible, and has affected more people, and we are running scared. But if we would just think how we have been taken through, and the rest of history, when the polio came in, the schools jumped in to help. But there's not much that the schools can do with this until we get a vaccine. And if we had time, we could go through the different phases of history that I've lived through. I've lived through the Victory Gardens during World War II and the people who lived in town. As long as my grandparents lived, and by the way, I was their favorite because I was the first child of their oldest child. That made me special, And it's all along about Easter time. And a lot of people like to say, well, where was she born? I was born in West Knoxville in a roadhouse during the Depression. Yeah. But I got to Union County just as fast as I could because all of my folks came from going Tennessee or from Sharps Chapel. My daddy and my grandmother both was born in Sharps Chapel. And people on the street at Maynardville, whenever I came here, after transferring from the Knoxville school system here, I came upon a school that was a high school, had an outside toilet, was 16-holer. You got very well acquainted with the girls that you went to the bathroom with.
No partitions in that,
no,
right?
No, none whatsoever.
partitions.
But we could tell you a lot of history. But right now, I want to go back in memory, and not so much for what I have done, but what I have seen the great people of rural East Tennessee do and live by. And I would like for us to take a visit to the garden. And they tell us now we can't even take a hamburger or a hot dog from Maynardville to Sharps Chapel and let somebody eat it. But, when we were growing up, what we did for a snack, after breakfast was over with, they put the leftovers in the warmer, and the cornbread from the day before was in the warmer. You know what I mean for a warmer? They had a cook stove, and then it has this little thing up the top. You'll have to use your imagination.
Yes.
And they had the leftovers there. We'd go in, and we'd get us a piece of cornbread, and we'd go out to the garden. And Grandpa Odell had a garden out beside the cabin, and he'd have tomatoes, and he'd have onions, And he didn't have any radishes like this. He called his parsnips. They was long and
Parsnips,
white.
yeah.
And we took our little grubby hands and we pulled up a onion and got it as much dirt off of it as we could. And there we had our snack. That was during the Depression time, and it was a good snack, and most of us are still living.
Did you eat it like an apple?
We ate it like an apple, and we got it all over our face, and then we wore dresses, and we'd take our dress and swap our chin off.
Swap
And
the chin.
didn't worry about what your breath smelled like
No,
afterwards,
no,
did you?
no, no.
No.
No, I even learned what a rolling store was and how you could trade. Grandma Odell died when I was shy of 3 years old, but I remember her because she gave us an egg. You know what an egg is?
Egg.
Egg.
We would call it in modern days.
She gave us all an egg, and we went down, and she said, now the rolling store is coming. I thought, what's a rolling store? After a while, I saw this coming down, and he stopped, and here was 4 little girls standing with our egg. His grandma called it an egg. Said, just hand it out there. Just hand it, little round egg. Here's your egg, honey. And we traded it for bubble gobble. Bubble double. And then when we got through chewing it, we put it on the bedpost. You know that old song that says?
Does your chewing gum lose its flavor
on
the bedpost overnight?
It don't. It don't.
And how many nights did your chewing gum stay on that bedpost?
I'm not telling you. All right. Okay. Now, most of the people in the canning, I'm going to tell you this, and then it's going to be Marilyn's time, but I bet you I can upstage her. That's been my goal in life.
No. Ronnie's already told me that I'm an old woman by being historical, but she's not going to upstage me.
Let's go to the cellar. That's where they put the canned goods. Now, I just brought 1 half-gallon jar, but I want you to know everybody can. Just think of this beautiful picture. Half gallons of peaches, half gallons of pears, half gallon of corn, half gallon of green beans, all half gallons. Well, why did they want half gallons? Half gallons of blackberries. Aunt Mame always had oats lots of times for breakfast, and she had blackberries as her fruit with them. Row after row after row of half-gallon jars in the cellar. And then, if they wanted to cook, they had also potatoes and other things like cabbages hid away in the cellar. Okay, go, dough roller.
And of course, their cellars were cooler. They were under the house, and they could keep their canned goods a little longer because they didn't have the way we have refrigeration and all of the things we have today, and they didn't have a way to add something to it that would make it last. So they kept it in the cellar and they would eat it. And I guess by now y'all are wondering why we're talking about cellars and canned goods and all of those things. Well, the Union County Heritage Festival is working on doing some heritage skills. And we have videoed these heritage skills along with Alicia Victoria, who is one of our county agents in our UT Extension office. And she applied for a grant, and it's called the Juanita Vasoli Grant. And the whole idea behind the grant is to carry on these heritage skills and to teach them intergenerationally between, of course, the young people and their parents or older, like grandparents and all, so that the skills will be carried on throughout and they will have life skills. And in the event of a pandemic, during this pandemic, a lot of people have grown their own little backyard garden, and now they're looking for ways to can what they've grown. And according to the news media the other night, all of our stores are just about out of the canned goods. But Alicia, in her wisdom, went ahead and worked out so that the people who participate in these online video classes will have their own little starter canning set. And so when she was at our meeting for the Heritage Festival, Miss Wanda came through, and she was, of course, with the Union County Historical Society, and we thought, well, this would be great. We could get some people from the Historical Society to come and talk about canning and biscuit making and sewing and even some woodworking down the road and basket weaving and maybe even some chair caning, and talk about these skills that helped all of our ancestors be self-sufficient. So, as Wanda said, canning was a real big part of what they did. That was the way they could keep their vegetables all winter long. And so one group here in Union County that has kept this going too, they had to quit doing it because they just ran out of people who kind of had the know-how and were willing to spend the time. But they've been a wonderful part of the Union County Heritage Festival since its beginning, and that is the Scottish Rites. And they, of course, sponsor the shoe program in our county. And one thing they're known for is their apple butter. And I just wanted to bring a jar of the apple butter. It's become kind of a collector's item. If you have one, you probably shouldn't tell very many people because they're not making it anymore unless you happen to know a couple of the Scottish Rites. They might share their recipe. But they were nice enough to bring the last run of their apple butter to last year's festival, and I'm trying real hard to get them to make one more run for next year, but I don't know that they will.
And do you know they even made that sugar-free for those of us who are diabetic?
Yes. And I love what it says on the label. It says, for the ingredients, apples, sugar, and cinnamon. And I can tell you this, and a whole lot of love.
One thing I noticed about these jars, this one right here, has the date on it when it was canned. My mother she would take little pieces of tape, and she'd write on the lids, but she'd take a little piece of tape, put it right in the middle, right on top of the seal, the year that she canned it.
Yeah. My grandmother used to, the adhesive tape, they called it, because she didn't have masking tape and things like that, but she'd take a little bit of the adhesive tape and put on the top of the jar and write the date.
Miss Talker, you sat there and rolled that rolling pin back and forth. Tell the history of that rolling pin. I want to hear that.
Okay, well, one thing that apple butter lots of times is used for is to put on your homemade biscuits. Well, it just so happened I grew up in a community in Knox County also called Norwood, and just down the road was a lovely lady named Kate Presnell Overton, and she was from Claiborne County. And her family was known for canning also. As a matter of fact, they had a cannery, one of the ones that you actually used. I used to laugh and say, oh my goodness, it's just like Dole pineapple. But I said, she would can in the metal cans, and she had a crimper. And I got to watch her do the crimping of the can, and I was like 12 years old, and I thought that was the coolest thing, because I thought you have to have on a factory, to get that done. But she just crimped that can right around through there, and I'd never seen a can like that. The other thing I'd never seen anybody do was use a pressure cooker. And Mama Kate could take she used the pressure cooker to do her canning. And the water bath, I don't know a whole lot about canning, but she would put her jars down in the pressure cooker, and in just a few minutes, it was all nice and heated, and I'd hear the pop, pop, pop.
Now, my mother was from the time she was terrified of the pressure cooker.
Oh, yeah.
The water bath is what she went by.
Yeah, well, see, that was the thing. I had seen my grandmothers do the water bath and all, but I'd never seen anybody do it with the pressure cooker. But boy, Mama Kate could fix pork chops, green beans from scratch.
What did you say her last name was?
She was an Overton.
Oh, that was Everett's grandmother's name. And you know what? We have in our family Overton.
Do you have a rolling pin?
I knew, yes.
Well, let me tell you about the rolling pin. But anyway, Mama Kate could cook that whole meal in less than 30 minutes from scratch, and if my mama cooked it, it took her 3 hours. But anyway, I got to tell you about the rolling pin. So Kate was a school teacher, just like we were, and she taught in a one-room school.
Me too.
And years ago, when they first started teaching, and they were teaching in the one-room school, they would room with a family that lived in the community. Well, it just so happened she roomed with the Overtons. And so Byron Overton, he was the oldest boy, he watched her the whole year, you know. He saw, he visited, she taught just like, and he just kind of took a liking to her. They went to church together some, you know, and she went with the Overtons, of course. And so the school year came close to being to the end, and he met her as she came home at the end of the year. And he said, and you know, they addressed each other like I'd call you Ronnie. Well, he didn't call her Kate. He said, Miss Presnell. He said, Miss Presnell, I'd like to show you something. Matter of fact, I'd like to give you something. If you'll just come right over here near the back porch. And so she went over to the back porch, and he kind of went over to where this little shed was, and he came out with something behind his back. And he said, now, Miss Presnell, there's a catch. Said, I'm going to give you this, but said, there's a catch. And she said, well, Mr. Overton, what's the catch? I don't know that I'll accept it with a catch. And he said, well, Miss Presnell, you can have this roller pin. I made it myself. It's out of cedar. But the catch is, I can be the only man that eats the biscuits it rolls. And she said, well, Mr. Overton, I'll have to think about that. And that was her answer for then. Well, a few days went by, and he got to inquiring, and she came back out to the Overtons, and she said, well, Mr. Overton, I've thought it over, and I believe that'll be just fine.
While she was thinking, did he let her keep the rolling pin?
No, he gave it to her then.
Okay, I wondered.
No, he gave it to her after she gave him the answer.
That's quite unusual, because Hattie Overton received hers for a wedding gift when she married Tate Cox.
And it's made of cedar, and evidently that, I didn't think about it till I was talking with Miss Wanda, and she said that Hattie had gotten the rolling pin too, made of cedar. So it must have been a tradition with the Overton family.
How times have changed. I wouldn't recommend anybody give their prospective bride a vacuum cleaner.
I got a vacuum cleaner when I got married.
All right, Ronnie. Can you have any idea what I'm doing?
I'm going to guess.
I'm playing Our Lady. Our Lady, of all the people I've known in my life, and I love my boys, and I love my Everett, and there are a few other people I may have loved a little, but Our Lady was my bright and shining star. I said to her one time about somebody, and she said, I know she's that way, but I love her anyway. And I thought, oh, just to be like Our Lady Perry, just to love them anyway, just like they are, you know. Our Lady never sat down but what she didn't have something to do. And she would have a little basket, and she did mending. Or she'd have squash that she would be fixing to either cut up and cook or bake. She was always busy with her hands. When she grew up, she had several families and had half brothers and sisters, but she would have spanked any of us that said half. Her mother was a Monroe and married a Sharp. She had 3 brothers from the Sharp family, and then whenever Mr. Sharp passed away, she had little Aunt Maggie, and little Aunt Maggie was a Monroe, and her daddy was little Doc Monroe, and then she married the Perry, and she had 4 Perry sisters, and so on down the line. And then Uncle Minyard and Aunt Haley and Aunt Laura was the last ones. But to her, and then there was also another one that she claimed, but she never permitted us to say half or anything. They were all family. And she was always working and cooking, and she could make the best soup in the world. But she saved everything. Do you know what she did with these peels like this? She had a little stew cup. It was really a little thin thing, looked like it had been with her for years, and she'd put all these peels in there. And while she was cooking, she'd put water up over the peelings, and she would cook those. Then we would say that we'd use a cheesecloth now, but she just had a real thin, I guess it was some type of rag, and she would squeeze that through, and she would save it. And whenever I saw this that I still had, it reminded me of how she would save everything. And out of these peels, and now they'll tell us, where do the vitamins come from in the potatoes and the apples and so on? She didn't know, but she just knew it was good, and she could feed somebody with her biscuits. And I have something that I would like to hand to you. You can get this and look at it in a minute. And remember, all these people, and the good Lord blessed her. She 6 weeks of living till she'd be 96 years old. And so far, my Uncle Richard lived to be 88. And so I'm in the chase to meet her. But if the good Lord blesses me, I'll have about 6 more years to go to be her age. If he don't, I'll just go meet her. She'll be waiting for me. Because you know what? I bonded with her because I was born at her house. And her little boy, Uncle Richard, was born in 1930, and I was born in 33. So I had her all by myself for almost 2 years, and then she had another baby when she was about 42 years old. That was Aunt Mary Helen. And she had 2 little girls younger than me, but I was always the one who lived on the farm that went to the field, both with Grandpa Odell and with Grandma too, Grandma Woods. She married a Woods. So just remember, when you see somebody with a knife and peeling, remember all the good things that you can use from that.
And isn't there a certain amount of pride in making the peel one continuous deal
yes,
and not
and I can
cutting
do
little
that.
pieces?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've noticed.
Okay, I want to tell you about some of these things, and Ronnie has already caught on to one that I don't know whether you caught it or not, that his mother had the same habit. I want to talk about this one. All of you know, if you've heard me talk, that I am the oldest child of Clifford and Virgie Woods and the only daughter. And so I have 7 brothers, one for every day of the week. And how many days I have gotten up and thanked the good Lord that he didn't make an 8 or a 9 or 10 day week. Just think what I'd still be doing. And when a lot of the girls wanted to, oh boy, that boy's cute, that boy's cute. I could see them old dirty socks down on the edge of the bed, or them old, all the things I was going to have to wash. And I thought, So I kind of stood off for a while. Waited till a jewel came by. But one of my brothers gave me this for a special time. And I hadn't opened it, and I thought, this is a special time. And this is the one that she said she knew Ben Woods. Ben Woods, his daddy canned this for me. This is my brother Harold. I call him the sweet one. I turned around and asked him if he knew your friend, Jim Woods. I didn't call him the sweet one. You know Jim Woods, don't you? Yeah, I've never heard Jim speak in anger but one time. And I was surprised because he's a preacher like Mr. Russell's a preacher, and they think they're brothers, and I guess they are, brothers in spirit. And so we were talking about children who had been mistreated. And all at once Jimmy said, that's when I'd put on the white coat and the cap. But he said, I'd want to take my hood off and have my gun. I'd want him to know who did it. I thought, is that my brother?
Yeah.
But there's still people that will stand for what's right. And that's what I like about, I said some things is coming back to bite me, and I'm not going to tell you where. But all the students that I always had, I would always tell them, say what you mean what you say, and don't back up. Oh boy, if I told you about some of the things that they're not backing up on, I'd like to give some of them a shove, but I guess I'll just keep my paddle in the basement. But this was a gift from, okay.
Now, do you know approximately how old that jar of beans is?
Yes, he canned it last year.
Okay.
But see, this has just been sitting around and drawn that down.
But do you know my mother has been gone 14 years, and we still have beans that she canned in the 70s. They're just as fresh today as they were the day of the seal.
Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
Now,
Oh, yeah.
getting back.
I wouldn't recommend that, Ronnie.
No, we pull them out for special occasions. They're still
Now,
good.
I want you to remember that in the olden days, all these were in half gallons. Aunt Mame would have she had high cholesterol. The doctor told her to eat oats every morning. She would open a can of half gallon of blackberries. This is the nice one I've got. I don't have a half a gallon. But when I babysat for Jean, Keck, Rick Heck's uncle. Whenever I was in high school, every once in a while I'd stay out a day and babysit their 2 children, feed them their breakfast, turn around and cook, and she had canned. I'd give the kids some fruit, usually blackberries, then make them a cobbler pie, cook their lunch. They'd come in and eat lunch and rest a while and go back to the fields to work. And I got $1.25 a day for taking care of the 2 kids, feed them their breakfast, cooking their lunch, and have enough cooked over for supper that night. And that's the reason I remembered the blackberries with Aunt Mame also. Aunt Mame would have blackberries with her oats. Then with the rest of them, she'd make a blackberry pie for the rest of the people that day. So they never wasted anything at all. Now I'm going to go to Aunt Ruth. Aunt Ruth, she's the one that used to have the headache, and she'd put a rag around her head and she'd say, "Oh, law, young'uns, my head's going to bust wide open." Well, we thought she had that rag around it to keep her head from busting wide open. We didn't know that she had that temple, pressed on the temple to keep it from throbbing,
Yeah.
So I called her one day and I said, "Aunt Ruth, I'm coming to see you." "Good Lord, child, what do you want me to cook you?" I said, "I want some of those little potatoes with that grease on them in the oven. I want meal gravy and that bacon that you fried and rolled it in meal. And I want tomato juice." "Is that what you want?" I said, "That's what you used to fix me when I was a kid." She said, "But law, child, that's all I had to fix you." But that's what I wanted. That was Depression time, But it was so good. They didn't waste anything. And that takes me back to Our Lady. They put the potatoes in the basement at Our Lady's home. And the only thing I ever heard her say was, no stepmother would ever run her away from home. She stood there and she ran the kitchen for her daddy with the others that came in. Now this lady over here with the pretty red hair, her family is also related to me, and she comes from the first family, Arthur Perry. Arthur and Aunt Maggie were the 2 older children from the Perrys. And then some of the rest of them just got there the best way they could, but then Grandma's family was the next 4 that came like that. But there was some branched off here and there everywhere. They just did the best they could do. It's kind of like another friend I heard say, they just came the best way to get there. All right? But here's the tomato juice that they had. Okay, it's a half a gallon. What do you think Aunt Ruth was going to do with the rest of that half a gallon of tomato juice whenever she opened it and gave us did you see how they knew what to give us that was good for us? We'd have blackberry juice. We'd have, and then you could have blackberry jelly, blackberry jam, and then we'd have tomato juice with cornbread, and then they'd start a pot of soup. You ought to think about Our Lady's soup. I've seen her many a time just to turn around as somebody else come through, empty up another can of tomato juice, a can of tomatoes, and a handful of macaroni, and she'd have enough to feed 4 more. Okay? And these are the things that most people had. Canning the fruit, they'd have blackberries, pick them in July, and they'd have apples, pears, and peaches, and that's the most of the half gallons that I would see in my Grandma Elsie cannon, and most all of them had that too. But a lot of people like to do beets, and pickled beets goes real good. And most everybody liked the dried beans, and they would do that. All right, Marilyn.
Well, I'll just tell you a little bit more about Mama Kay and my 2 grandmothers. Well, Mama Kay would make her apple butter, and she used those little transparent apples, and transparent apples are just what they say. When you get it all done and everything's cooked, you can kind of see through those apples, and they don't have very much color, and that wasn't real appetizing to a lot of people. So down at the store, they'd send the children down and they would get Red Hots, and they'd get the Red Hots and bring them back and put the Red Hots in the apples to make them pink, because that was more pleasing. And it gave them a good flavor, and it was a kind of a cinnamony flavor. And what she would tell me was that cinnamon cost money, and they didn't always have money to buy the cinnamon. But for some reason, the store always had the Red Hots. So,
Yeah, and you could
So
probably
they
get
would-
them for a penny a pack.
yeah, and they would mix them up, and it would give the cinnamon flavor and also the sweetness.
Tell them how you
And-
got that. Tell them how you got that show.
Oh, well, Miss Wanda, because I didn't have any Red Hots.
And I didn't have an apple, so I said, I'll give you some Red Hots if you'll bring me an apple.
There you go.
And that's the way the older folks got along. They
That's
traded.
right. They
You
worked
had
together.
more than you needed one thing, you had more than you needed another, and
Yes.
you swapped out.
And you put it together, and I mean, they broke beans together and sat on the front porch. I can remember my grandmother, and she'd get her friends together, and they'd have these bushels of beans, and they'd sit there and break the beans, and that's kind of the way they did. But I wanted to tell you about, this is my husband's family's rolling pin. Now, and this is a lot like the rolling pin that my grandmother on my mother's side had. And my grandmother would she would make her biscuits, and she would roll them out, but she didn't roll it very much. She'd just start it, kind of get it started, and she'd throw some flour over it, and then she'd take her hands and she'd pat it around like that. And she made what was called a biscuit pone. And then she'd bake that biscuit pone, and she'd set it right in the middle of the table. And as my mother used to say, all the kids would just snatch and grab. And they'd just grab off a piece of that biscuit pone, and then take that apple butter and put it on there, or the jelly, or whatever they'd rather have. And that was the way you did. There wasn't anything like, like we're having to go through now, where you wash your hands for 20 seconds and things like that. Because believe it or not, both of my grandmothers were in the city of Knoxville, and neither one of them had inside plumbing in the city of Knoxville. So you believe what you want, but I can tell you from firsthand, and so can Miss Wanda, that a lot of those houses, especially over in Mechanicsville and Lonsdale, Fifth
Maryland
Avenue,
Lonsdale.
yes,
Yep, we lived
6th
there,
Avenue,
in that.
right in there, they did not have any indoor plumbing. And so I can remember at my grandmother's house, Mama Geddes, on my mother's side, she had a pump on the back porch, then a cistern for a while, but then she actually had a pump, and they rigged up this, the fellas were kind of industrious, and they would come up with ways to do things. And so Mama Geddes wanted the water to come inside, so they got these pole-like things that had holes in them, and they put that up in there, and later on they replaced it with pipe. And you'd go out and you'd pump it, and the water would come up and it'd come inside.
I can remember my grandfather Sampson. He lived way back in the Claiborne County sticks. And he caught his cistern full of water off the gutter.
Yeah.
I mean, you got the cold soot in the winter and everything. It'd come down that gutter into that cistern.
Yeah.
It had a pump.
Yeah.
And one of the grandkids one time got a little mean and threw a stick of cedar wood down in the cistern.
Oh, no.
Their water tasted like cedar for a long time.
For a long time.
Long time. But they also, back then, they didn't have screen doors all the time.
Right.
They certainly didn't have air conditioning.
No.
And refrigeration and it was nothing unusual. I'm
Right,
sure if they set the food out, it's cooked and it's set on the table all day, they'd cover it up, and
Yes.
then they'd uncover it and eat dinner, and they'd uncover it and have supper.
Right. In my mother's family, there were 9 children, and a couple of them moved out, because there was quite an age range, but we would go to Mama Geddes's on Sunday, and my grandmother would always make my mother a blackberry cobbler. No matter dead of winter or middle of the summer, we had blackberry cobbler. And they, like you said, they'd feed everybody, and you kind of ate in shifts sometimes, but they'd feed everybody, and they'd just put it in the middle of the table and throw that big old tablecloth over it, and everybody who came in ate it. And it was right out of the can, whatever they'd canned or whatever they had fresh. Yeah.
And very few people seem to die of food poisoning.
No, I don't. No, I don't even remember anybody getting sick.
When they talk about that, when I found this to bring to illustrate, what you could do with apple peelings, I thought of one of my former Well, I had 4 of the children in that family, and the parents must have liked what I did because they put them all in my class, and they never did say anything about what I did to them.
Right.
So that was a pretty good compliment. And I remember the daddy saying, "What's wrong with us today? We don't get enough good germs." You know, and he said, Mom would say, "Go out there and get a jar of that blackberry jam." Said I'd bring it in, and I don't know whether you remember this or not. They put a wax on top of the jam.
Yes,
Remember that?
yes.
And then
The
they put
paraffin-like
and
stuff
then
in
yeah,
it.
paraffin. And then they'd put a lid on it. Well, you take the
Right.
lid off. Well, the lid wasn't tight, and the paraffin would hold a little bit, but you'd see a little mole on the top. Well, you just took a spoon and you raked that mole off, and then you ate it. So then you got some of the good germs.
Yeah.
And he said that was what was wrong with us, that we had all these diseases. We didn't get enough good germs.
Good germs.
Okay. Ronnie has him a jar. I don't think it ever had any moonshine in it. Would you come here? I promise you, if you fill this full of dimes, you'll be better off than you were when you came. Okay. Don't you wish that we'd all had sense enough to save all those old blue and yellow and so on, those old blue and green jars? How many of us have ever been guilty of putting them in the trash and off they go because we go to the more modern ones?
And now this very
And
stuff that we have thrown away,
I know
all
we
these
could be
years,
all be
we
millionaires.
go to the antique
you
store
see-
and pay $25
Oh,
for a
yes.
jar like
Well,
that.
see the bubbles in
See
it?
the bubbles?
See the bubbles?
Yeah.
Now I know you've got a lid. I couldn't find another lid. Didn't have time to find him one. But and so you got the lid. He didn't.
But I got the date.
Yep.
This says Mason's Patent, November 30, 1858.
Well,
Wow.
what did she get?
What's yours say?
Oh yeah, yeah.
That makes it.
That makes it worth
Yes.
more. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sure does. And what I have here, I don't know how long they want to hear us talk. But this came in one of my magazines, and so I happen to have 2 of them. And so I brought this to help. These are the most unique little recipes right here. If anybody just started canning. And the first one is pickle it, and it's cherry tomatoes, and gingery cucumbers, and spicy carrots, and sweet and tangy blackberries, and a summer squash. And these are all just in the little pint jars. And so I thought that might be unique to start some of the younger people on. Just let them have, and that's what they call side dishes. And I will close with what I have. I have lots and lots of things I could tell you about my ancestors. I've probably been the most blessed person that anybody could be. And when I've lived, I've lived through peacetime. My grandpa took us to the Lee Theater down on Tennessee Avenue. He had 3 boys in the service. He would take all of us kids for a treat to watch the cartoons. He went to see the newsreels so he could see if he could see a glance of one of the neighborhood boys on the newsreel or one of his own. And then they had a campaign where they would give saving stamps. So that was a good memory. He also rounded us kids up and took them to his church. He was a member of the Primitive Baptist Church, and we had to walk. And we walked through what we call Rookside Field over Central Avenue and out Norwood to his church. And I guess I was probably about 8 years old. And they had a foot washing, and I couldn't understand why they just washed one foot and didn't wash the other one, you know. But at least he took us to see, you know, those things.
Right.
And just like I said about my grandma, that she said, "I know she is, but I love her anyway." You know, isn't that a good model to go after? And then my grandmother, Elsie England, she was so good to my grandpa. Grandma Julie, who was a Williams Hopper, she passed away from a stroke when I was almost 3 years old, the one that gave me the ag. And in about a year or so, he was lonely, so he married Elsie, and they had 5 or 6, 7 kids. Molly O'Dale died young. Could you imagine somebody being named that, Molly O'Dale? They'd listen to Molly O'Dale on the radio, you know. And then they had Alton, and Alton married Mr. Collins' aunt, and so on and so forth. You've heard that tale. And so and Suda May, and then the twins, and so I have really been blessed with a lot of people who love me, and if the others that don't love me, they don't tell me because they're afraid of the ones who do love me.
And I wanted to tell you This one was similar to what my grandmother on my father's side used later. And the lovely thing that she did that is just ingrained in my mind, she would take her biscuits and she would keep them. She made sure she made about twice what people would eat. And she would keep them till the next day. And she made, see, used to when you had biscuits, biscuits weren't just for breakfast. She would take those biscuits and she would make bread pudding. And the bread pudding, some people ate it for breakfast, but a whole lot of people ate it for dessert. And then if she didn't have everything she needed to make the bread pudding, she made soakies. Now, a lot of people don't know what soakies are, but at my house, my daddy made soakies. And you take that syrup, you take and make syrup out of sugar and water and put it in the skillet, and you could use an iron skillet or any other kind of skillet, and then you drop those day-old biscuits down in there and let them get all gooey and everything, and then you'd pop that thing in the oven and let it get a little crisp on the top and melt butter over it. And honey, we thought that was better than any chocolate cake or anything that we could have had. Those biscuits were wonderful. And some people would put the maple syrup, and then some people did coffee soakies. Now, I never was a fan of that growing up, but
Sounds
some
pretty good
people
now,
were.
doesn't it? Looking back
Yeah.
on it.
So I wanted to share that with you and tell you a little bit too. One thing, back when they made biscuits and all, you know, you always wore an apron. Now, I don't have the kind of apron with me that my grandmothers wore. What I have, you're not going to believe, but it's kind of like what you were saying, Miss Wanda. They didn't throw anything away. And if somebody gave them a gift, if like handkerchiefs or something, they would use the handkerchiefs, but lots of times they would make it into something else. Well, it just so happened my grandmother was given some green and red handkerchiefs. Now, this is not the apron she cooked in. She would cook in it was a white apron, and she'd put it up around her neck, or sometimes they had a little pinstripe to them, or sometimes they were flowered. I mean, she had all kinds of aprons. But to be festive on Christmas holidays, she took and she made this apron out of the handkerchiefs, and she'd put this over her apron. That was her Christmas festive, see. And so I inherited the handkerchief apron. And somewhere I have one of her old-timey, white aprons that were real long and everything, and she would do everything from gather eggs with that apron to cook, and wear that apron and wipe the child's
I've got a quilt made
out of the handkerchiefs. Yeah.
back in the bedroom.
Yes.
Back to their movie.
And my grandmother on my dad's side, this was one of the things that I got from her. They were not finished. And one of these days, now it took me 3 years to make a dress, so I'm not holding my breath to actually, sew these or quilt them. But they had what was called Dutch boy and Dutch girl. But to me, these kind of look like farm boy and farm girl, because they don't have the little hats that turn up like the Dutch boy ones do. But anyway, she pieced enough and had them all set, and she just never got to do them.
Why don't you have pillows made out of those?
Well, I'm going to have a quilt made out of it.
Oh, you got enough for?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. She made several of them, and
Those are pretty.
they're real nice, and I'm just real proud of them. But this is something you were talking about that they did with their hands. They would sit and cut things out and sew and all, and knit and crochet and do all those types of things.
And they sewed these things by hand.
Yes, absolutely.
And every stitch was
Yes.
perfect. All the stitches were the exact same size, weren't
Polly Dyer
Oh, yeah.
was the best of making the stitches all.
they? She had some beautiful quilts.
So, well, Mr. Mincey, I just don't know what else to tell you.
Oh, I'm sure we could think of something.
We
but
probably could.
I'll tell you this, when they transferred me to high school because they couldn't put up them big long-legged boys and they wanted me over there, And I got along just fine that first year. And the next year they sent Marilyn Toppins over there. Well, I'll tell you what, if the fire didn't fly then. And I said, well, we're doing pretty good, aren't we? And Barbara told me, she said, oh, Lord, Wanda, we thought it was bad when you got here, but said, you were an angel. So I guess that's a good way to end it.
That's a good way to end it.
That is the end of that history. That is history.
Well, my daddy told me one time if everything was peaceful, I'd find some way to stir it up.
And you know,
He meant you, not him, right?
hey, do you know how they got rid of her daddy out of the Knoxville post office? My uncle wrote a letter and put him down where?
In Greenback. He was the postmaster of Greenback.
I said, I asked Uncle Richard one day, I said, did you ever know Mr.
Maples.
Maples? Yeah, she's a Maples. I like to tell people in Union County, when they say something about her, I say, oh, she's a Maples.
That's right, I am.
and he wrote the letter for Mr. Graves and I asked Uncle Richard one time, I said, how did you go up so fast? I said, he said, well, I just put down my record. I said, I put down I was an Eagle Scout. I said, who was your Eagle Scout master? I said, I know it was that little Methodist church there on the corner of Vermont and Virginia Avenue. And he said, yeah, and he grinned. He said, Mr. Graves' brother. So see, when you know the inside story, you can find the rest of the history.
And my dad was well known with the post office, not so much for being a postmaster, but because he and people from the post office would go fishing, and Daddy made the best cat head biscuits and gravy. Daddy didn't fish, but he loved to make the biscuits and he loved to eat. So.
All right, that's all you get.
Well, thank you, Mama
You
Wanda.
can have that apple.
Yeah, she just gave you my apple, you know.
Oh, well, and it tasted good.
It tasted good. There you go.
Ladies, would you come back and be with us again sometime?
Oh, we have enjoyed
'Cause I
this
know
so
we,
much.
we have a lot more we could talk about.
Yes, and
Endless topics.
And
endless
we're
topics.
going to do a series of these, and we'll have another person that's going to, by the name of Ellen Perry, that's going to work with you and talk to you about
Bless her
some
heart.
stories. And then Alicia Victoria is going to come and talk about the grant and how this all got started. And we just hope that everyone will enjoy learning these heritage crafts and carrying them on, and then come and see some masters at work next year at the Heritage Festival, October the 2nd, 2021.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you all for tuning us in. And until the next time, I'm Ronnie Mincey, and we'll see you at the next episode of Uniquely Union. Thank you.